Hi, I'm Simon Pimenta, and today I want to talk about the topic of beating anxiety. A couple of things. I will share as much information as I can in the time, and you might find that it stirs emotions, so do take care of yourself. If you are feeling somewhat vulnerable, consider whether this is a good thing to be doing right now. You can always watch it later if you are feeling vulnerable, but take care of yourself if it does stir emotions. At the end, I will let you know what to do if you want to learn more about what it is I do. Do feel free to leave a comment in the box so that I know that people can actually hear me and see me now. So, a couple of definitions. I want to define the difference between fear and anxiety. I remember a psychologist explaining it to me this way, that fear is, imagine you step outside of your front door, and sitting out front of you, in front of your door is a hungry tiger. Your body is going to generate a response to a very real threat. So that is fear. Now imagine the next day you are about to step outside of the house, and just as you reach for the door handle, you remember that yesterday there was a tiger outside your front door. So now this is an anticipation that the tiger might be there again. So you actually feel anxiety. So, what are the causes of anxiety? Well, it can be that if your body isn't working properly, then that can be in itself a cause of anxiety, and anyone with ME/CFS knows that. Also, if you have issues like adrenal fatigue or lack of energy, there isn't actually energy getting into your body, that will tip your body into a state of fight or flight. And if you are hungry, if your blood sugar is low, that also can tip you into a state of fight or flight. Often when I talk about stress and the idea of a zebra is stressed when it's being chased by a lion, people often say, oh, that poor zebra. And actually, but if you're that lion and you're hungry and you need to eat, otherwise, your life is in danger, then you're actually going to be stressed and your body is going to be in that stress response state. Obviously, things like stimulants, coffee, tea can actually activate the anxiety response. I remember a time when I was working and I just had too many coffees, and I was in a meeting and I just felt absolutely wired, and I remember deciding at that point that I had to just give up drinking coffee. Medication can actually trigger anxiety. I remember a client saying she was on medication for anxiety and it actually created restless leg syndrome in her, and that actually just fed into the anxiety. Also, recreational drugs can cause anxiety. A friend of mine who has ME/CFS smoked marijuana, and he had an experience where he ended up in psychiatric hospital, and he didn't know how he'd got there, and he doesn't remember much about it, but the psychiatrist thought it was triggered by him being a long-term user of marijuana. So our environment can trigger stress. So for instance, if you're in a noisy environment or somewhere where the light is very bright and strong, that can trigger feelings of anxiety. Obviously, if you're in a war zone, that kind of environment, or you're in an environment where, for instance, I had a client whose boss was a bully, which meant that she was always ill at ease. But in this session, I'm really going to focus on the psychological aspect of anxiety. So as it relates to the mind and the emotions of a person. So what are the causes of anxiety? So the causes can include our experience as a child, the way we were brought up. If we were nurtured, then that can help us feel calm and relaxed and confident in ourselves. If we were nurtured in a way that was unsettling, then that can actually have a long-term impact. For example, if a parent was a worrier, then we can learn to be anxious and to copy that behaviour. There is a debate about nature versus nurture. So, for example, I remember chatting to someone about this, about, what influences our personality. And she said something very interesting, which is that when her first child was born, it's almost like when he was born, she immediately knew that he was quite an anxious baby. And it was as if he was saying, actually, this is a bit scary out here. Can I go back inside? When her second child was born, he was the complete opposite. His sort of approach was, where's the party? And he's always been a bit of a party animal. Now, the first child did actually learn to become a confident person, even though as a child they were very shy. Life events can be a factor. You may be familiar with the stress test. I think this index was created in the 1960s, which is why at the bottom it says if you've got a mortgage over £20,000, that can be a stress factor. I think for most people, if they had a mortgage of £20,000 now, or $20,000, they'd be quite pleased. But, if you have an accident, redundancy, having a child, short-term illness, trauma, these things can also impact on our, ability to generate anxiety. And then there can be life strains. So, for instance, being well with MECFS, when it's an ongoing issue, can be a source of stress. It can be other things like your environment. For instance, if let's say, for example, your father is an alcoholic and he's unpredictable, that can cause you to become quite an anxious person. If you're in a stressful relationship or dysfunctional relationship, as I mentioned earlier, if your boss or even your life partner is a bully or is abusive, that can generate anxiety. So I want to talk about types of anxiety. So there's 3 categories I want to talk about. Number 1, phobias. People often think of phobias, fear of flying, fear of spiders or snakes or tall buildings. But the phobia can be something just like talking to people. Then we've got situational anxiety. So, for instance, when someone is anxious about meeting new people, but they're completely okay or comfortable when they're around friends. And then there's the non-specific anxiety. So, for instance, this is someone, I remember a friend of mine saying, I just don't feel relaxed all the time, and I don't quite know why I don't feel relaxed. I'm always on edge, just can't switch off. So how do we beat anxiety? Oops, let's just go back. So I actually used to be a worrier. I did learn it from my dad, who was a worrier, and I discovered that it is possible to change. And I'll talk more about that as we go along. So if you are a worrier or anxious, what we need to do is to develop resilience. So how would you define resilience? I would define resilience as the ability to spring back, resume original state, the ability to endure. There are 2 elements to being resilient, I think, in relation to people. There's the reactive element, being able to recognise when we've been knocked off balance and knowing how to restore equilibrium. And then there's the proactive element. This is about developing the mindset and thinking skills so that we're less likely to be knocked off balance in the first place. So how do we build resilience? Well, we need to understand the steps that we are taking to generate anxiety. And in order to do that, we need to think about the anxiety in terms of the psychological elements. So the psychological is to do with the beliefs, the thinking, the feelings, the physical elements, how we feel physically, so noticing the sweaty palms, the heart beating, and how we respond to that. And the behavioural elements, what is the consequence of those feelings? So, for example, if a person is feeling anxious or feels anxious when they are in a situation where they're meeting a new person, they might avoid doing that. So what are the behaviours that we adopt in response to that anxiety? So we need to understand how the mind and brain work. And just to define those terms, mind, I'm talking about the part of us that thinks, that makes decisions, and the brain, that physical organ in our head. So, and in order to understand how the mind and brain work, we need to understand the concept of neuroplasticity. I've actually made a little video on this topic, so I thought rather than repeat myself, I might as well just play the video. So let's just do that now. So scientists used to think that the adult brain doesn't change. It was only as recently as 2000 that a researcher from University College London called Eleanor Maguire researched the brains of black cab drivers to see what changes learning the knowledge had on their brains. Black cab drivers have to memorise 25,000 streets in London and have to be able to describe the route between any 2 points. I've actually tested a friend who's a black cab driver, and he can name side streets and side streets of side streets. What Eleanor Maguire discovered was that a part of the brain of black cab drivers, the hippocampus, which is responsible for spatial awareness and memory, was enlarged compared to the general public. So the principle here is that our brain has the capacity to grow with use, and this is called neuroplasticity. So every time we use it, the brain builds connections. So that means the brain is a bit like a muscle. Whatever we practice, we get good at. Now this has advantages. It means that we get good at things that are useful. So if I practice learning the guitar, the more I practice the chord of C, after a while my fingers will just automatically move to that position without me having to think about it consciously. The disadvantages are that we can get really good at things that are not that useful. And these patterns, as we've already said, can become unconscious and automatic. So we need to understand this. How is it that our responses become conditioned? The work of Pavlov gives us some insight into that. He was a psychologist, and he did an experiment where every time he fed his dogs, he would ring a bell. And after a while, just the very act of ringing the bell would cause the dogs to salivate. They had associated the sound of the bell with food. There were some researchers who were very interested to see if humans could be conditioned in the same way. So they did some research which probably wasn't very ethical. They got a baby or a toddler and they did an experiment where they put in front of this baby Albert a rat, a rabbit, and I believe a snake, to see what response the baby would have to those animals. Now, you may have guessed that because the baby had no experience of these animals, he didn't know that he should be frightened. What they did is they banged a gong behind the baby. The baby got startled and started to cry. So now they showed the baby the rat, and every time they showed the baby the rat, they banged the gong. And after a short while, they were able to just show the baby the rat, and the baby started crying, because again, it had associated the rat with the feelings it had when the gong was banged.